The Ozarks summer was dying hard. The afternoon light in Harvest Creek was a heavy, coppery yellow, filtered through the smoke of distant controlled burns and the threat of an imminent storm. This small, fiercely self-reliant community, carved out of the dense forest, was defined by its isolation and its unyielding Old Testament faith. Everything here was hard-won: the soil, the silence, and the salvation. Dr. Elias Thorne was an anchor of uncomfortable modernity in this antiquated world. 5 years removed from the gaslit science of St. Louis, Elias believed in the microscope, the scalpel, and human logic. He rode his sturdy mare, Bess, through the main stretch of town, observing the familiar, unsmiling faces. To the residents of Harvest Creek, Elias was a necessary evil. A man who could set a broken bone, but whose ideas about Pasteur's germ theory and skepticism toward the literal devil made him a perpetual outsider. His destination was the Gable Farm, a remote patch of land further up the hollow. The summons, delivered by a frantic, breathless boy named Thomas, had been cryptic and deeply chilling. "It's Josiah, Doc. He's speaking like a preacher, but the words are full of sickness." When Elias finally reached the small, rough-hewn cabin, the usual sounds of late summer farm life, the cluck of fowl, the metallic ring of a distant hammer, were silenced. An absolute quiet had fallen upon the place, heavier and more menacing than the oppressive air. The front door was closed, latched from the inside, and the only sign of life was a single, low-burning kerosene lamp in the front window. Elias dismounted, the mud sucking at his boots. He rapped sharply on the door. It was opened by Deacon Silas Miller, whose face, usually carved with the rigid lines of self-righteous piety, was now slack and pale with genuine terror. He did not speak, simply stepping aside to allow Elias to enter the small, suffocating space. The air inside was thick and close, smelling of unwashed linens, feverish sweat, and a profound, pervasive fear. Widow Martha Gable, a woman whose life had been a testament to resilience, sat hunched by the stone fireplace. She was clutching her massive family Bible, not for comfort, but as a defensive shield. Her 2 younger children were pressed into a corner, their eyes fixed on the center of the room with a wide, unblinking horror. In the middle of the room, Josiah, a child of 8 known for his shy obedience, was a terrifying tableau. He lay strapped to his narrow wooden cot, not thrashing, but held rigid by leather ties wrapped around his small wrists and ankles. His entire body was unnaturally taut, his spine arched, lifting his head and feet slightly from the mattress. "Elias," Martha whispered, her voice a brittle, broken sound. "It came on him at supper. He was fine. Then he started shaking. Now he's speaking. It's not fever, doctor. It is the evil." Elias ignored the pronouncement, his focus purely clinical. He approached the cot. Josiah's eyes, usually the color of clear creek water, were now dilated and severely bloodshot, fixed intensely on the ceiling. Elias felt for a pulse, rapid, shallow, but strong enough. His skin was damp, a low, persistent fever marking his condition. "Josiah, son, can you look at me? Tell me where you are sore," Elias requested gently, his voice low and deliberately reassuring, a steady beacon in the room's hysteria. The boy did not turn his head. A sound, too low and gravely for an 8-year-old, scraped out of his dry throat. The words were perfectly enunciated, carrying an archaic, learned cadence. "Vain is the help of man, physician. Your simple tinctures cannot cure the corruption planted in the root of the soul." The voice was not loud, but it was absolutely chilling in its clarity and its mature vocabulary. The words, echoing the severe, punitive rhetoric of the strictest sermons, caused Martha Gable to emit a choked sob. Elias pressed his professional detachment tighter around him. "Where did you learn that language, Josiah? Who taught you to speak of the root of the soul?" Josiah's lips barely moved. His eyes flickered down, finally meeting Elias's gaze, but the look held no recognition, only unnerving judgment. "It is the ancient tongue, Doctor, the echo of the Rosary's curse. I speak the sin of the lineage that begat me, and the serpent lies not in the wound of the flesh, but in the heart of the mother who hath borne me in sin." The specificity of the accusation, levelled at his own mother, was devastating. Martha recoiled violently, burying her face in the Bible. The fear in the room reached a breaking point. As Elias rolled the boy's shirt up to listen to his chest, checking for the pneumonia the boy's fever might indicate, he saw something clutched tightly in Josiah's small, rigid right hand, resting over his breastbone. He carefully pried the small fingers open. It was a rosary, not the plain, humble wooden cross typical of Harvest Creek's Protestant homes, but a heavy, ornate Catholic chain. The beads were a shocking, deep, blood-red glass, and the metal crucifix was cold and intricately filigreed. "Where did he get this, Martha?" Elias asked, holding the forbidden object up. Martha forced herself to look, her eyes wide with terror. He had it. He was playing where he shouldn't, near the crumbling stone, the St. Michael's Chapel. He was there 3 days past when the rain cleared. They said that ruin was cursed, tainted with papist devilry. "It is the work of the demon, Doctor, brought forth by that wicked, unholy symbol." Elias tucked the rosary into a clean cloth and placed it in his medical satchel. The sheer depth of the community's fear concerning the Catholic relic was clear. He administered a mild, plant-based sedative to Josiah, a simple medicine to calm the physical convulsions and interrupt the horrifying recitation. "This is not possession, Martha. This is a sickness I do not yet understand," Elias insisted, projecting a confidence he did not entirely feel. "Keep the other children far from him. Give him clean water. I must consult my research and analyze this object. I will return before the storm breaks fully." Stepping back out into the oppressive twilight, Elias felt the full, crushing weight of the town's terror. The forbidden Catholic chapel, the antique relic, and the children's terrifying theological speech were fusing into a powerful, uncontrollable narrative. He was no longer battling a clinical disease. He was fighting an idea, a religious certainty that was far more virulent than any physical contagion. He rode Bess back toward his own small cabin. The first large drops of rain began to fall, hitting the dry earth with a dull, echoing thump. His wife, Clara Thorne, a woman who was quietly brilliant and equally stifled by the rigid local culture, was waiting by the fireplace, reading a well-worn copy of John Milton, a rebellious choice in a town that preached only the straight path of the Bible. "You look as though you've crossed the river Styx, Elias," she observed, her sharp eyes taking in his exhaustion. "Worse than the damned," he said, dropping his coat and spilling the contents of his satchel onto the table. "I have seen a child speak like a scholar of damnation. Look at this, Clara." He pushed the red rosary toward her. Clara picked it up, her expression shifting from curiosity to grim focus. "This is centuries old, certainly predates our settlement. Why was Josiah Gable holding this?" Elias recounted the entire ordeal, the arched back, the precise, chilling accusations, and the widow's hysteria about the old chapel ruin. Clara turned the crucifix over, her gaze steady. "Elias, what if it isn't demonic, and it's not simple fever? What if he's not dreaming the words but reenacting them? What if he is repeating something he heard or read?" He paused, the blood chilling in his veins. Heard? In that dilapidated ruin? What kind of thing could be left in that isolated, forbidden place to create a terror strong enough to physically imprint a ritual of self-damnation onto a child's mind? Clara looked at him, her eyes burning with an intense investigative fire that mirrored his own scientific skepticism. "A forgotten history, Elias. A powerful, terrifying human act that was never allowed to die. And if one child has been exposed to the secret, It is only a matter of hours until the contagion spreads. He stared at the blood-red rosary. The relic, the rhetoric, the forbidden location. The psychological bomb had detonated in Harvest Creek, and they were the only ones willing to find the human hand that had struck the match. The lantern light was an insecure yellow against the black window panes. Outside, the rain was no longer a downpour. It was a rhythmic, hammering percussion. Inside the Thorns' small parlor, the stillness felt fragile, a thin veneer of domestic calm over a core of mounting terror. Elias Thorne was working with a methodical frenzy. His medical bag lay open, a chaos of vials and instruments. He'd cleared their dining table, spreading out his tools and texts. A man whose life was usually dictated by careful measurement and clinical observation. He felt a cold pressure building in his chest, a purely psychological symptom. He was fighting the clock and the town's rapidly crystallizing belief in the absolute supernatural. Across the table, Clara had spread a large, brittle map of the Ozark topography. Her shawl was draped over the back of her chair, a signal of her unwavering, intense focus. "It is a human weapon, Elias, not a demonic one," Clara stated, her voice low but steady, like the river's undertow. She tapped the map, her finger resting on the dense green woodland that shielded Harvest Creek from the outside world. The community fears what it cannot categorize. The Catholic faith is alien to them. Therefore, the St. Michael's Chapel is cursed. When the children began to display this madness, the town reached for the nearest, most terrifying symbol. This Rosary. Elias did not look up from the small tarnished silver crucifix he was examining with his magnifying glass. But the words, Clara, that's the anomaly. It's not fever-induced gibberish. It's too specific, too learned. The serpent, the ancient tongue, the heart of the mother born in sin. A child, raised in this rigid simplicity, does not conjure that rhetoric from thin air. He is repeating a precise script. He placed the rosary down. The dark red glass beads reflected the lamp flame like drops of dried blood. The symptom is speech. The cause is likely an audio-visual trauma. He didn't dream the words. He absorbed them. Clara pointed to the thicket on the map marked Old Stone Ruins. The widow Gable confirmed he found the rosary near the chapel. It's the only place he could have been exposed to such specific language, especially language warped by zealotry. The walls, the air, the dust. It became a recording vessel for a historical event. The town avoids it, but a curious boy wouldn't. Elias pushed his chair back, the scrape of wood against the floor loud in the small room. His decision was made. Then we follow the physical trail now, before their fear makes this whole town blind. Tonight, we visit the chapel. We find out what else is there. Once Reverend Blackwood hears of 3 or 4 afflicted children, he will use the hysteria to demonize me and my science. We need concrete evidence of the human origin. He moved to the small closet for his heavy coat, the rough wool offering a thin defense against the elements. "I'm not staying," Clara announced, already reaching for her own coat. There was no room for discussion in her tone. "You need a witness and a historian. My logic is a necessary counterweight to your medicine in this fight. Besides, you're the city doctor, the easy target. I am still a local daughter. They will hesitate to turn on me as readily." Her practical resolve was a comfort. They secured 2 sturdy oil lanterns and stepped outside. The night was a sensory assault. The wind was a solid force tearing at their clothing, and the mud sucked at their boots with a disturbing finality. The ride to the remote chapel was a study in isolation. Bess, the mare, moved nervously, snorting against the rain and the wind-whipped branches. The trail quickly dissolved into a grueling path of exposed roots and churning silt. After 40 minutes of relentless ascent, Clara signaled, "There, the briars." They dismounted, the silence after the horse's heavy breathing oddly unnerving. Pushing through the thick, wet undergrowth, they came upon it, a small, dark stone structure utterly conquered by the forest. The St. Michael's Chapel was less a building and more a geological feature, a pile of damp grey limestone, its roof caved in, its narrow window shattered into a jagged mouth. Elias kicked open the rotting door. The interior was utterly stagnant. The air was a suffocating blend of mold, bat guano, and the metallic tang of damp rock. There was no sense of holiness here, only the profound weight of abandonment. Elias, the doctor, started with the physical environment. He carefully scraped dust from the altar stone and collected a vial of the muddy floor residue. Routine provided an anchor in the terrifying unfamiliarity. Clara, the investigator, moved with slow precision. The altar, Elias. Look at the base. Beneath the century of debris, a small area of the dirt floor near the stone altar was distinctly cleaner, as if swept repeatedly. Near this spot, small, shallow scores marked the stone itself. Someone was here recently doing something deliberate, Elias observed, holding his lantern low. More than just playing. Josiah was mimicking an action. Clara crouched down, and they left something behind. Here. She pointed to a spot where the heavy stone met the ground. Half buried in the soil was a piece of thick, dark glass, curved and shiny, a fragment of a vessel. Elias carefully wrapped it in a piece of medical gauze. He straightened, his lantern beam sweeping across the cold stone, illuminating the deep seams in the altar. In one such fissure, almost perfectly hidden by black creeping moss, he saw it. A small, tightly rolled scroll of aged parchment, tied with a dark, frayed thread. Elias carefully used his forceps to extract the relic. It was agonizingly fragile. He unrolled it gently, the paper crackling like brittle fire. The script, though faded, was dense and written in an educated, flowing hand. He began to read the cold, dead words aloud, the sound echoing ominously against the broken walls. And so the confessor, in his madness, began to see the children not as innocents, but as vessels for the original corruption. He preaches from the altar with a voice not his own, a voice of furious judgment, twisting the holy words into a mandate for self-flagellation and accusation. He makes them touch the blood-red beads and repeat the ancient creed of sin until their minds are weary and their spirits are broken. He seeks to burn the sin from them by making them confess the sins of their parents with the eloquence of the damned. He calls this a cleansing, but it is a possession of the spirit by the human cruelty of dogma. I write this, Father, as a final warning before his methods silence all reason. May this confession remain hidden until the purity of his evil is forgotten by time, until it is found again. The silence that followed was absolute. They had found the source, and it was horrifyingly human. "The confessor," Clara murmured, her breath misting in the cold air. Not a demon, a deeply disturbed, educated priest who ruled this chapel decades ago. The ritual, the words, the human cruelty that created the echo. And the rosary, Elias concluded, the weight of the beads in his pocket suddenly feeling like a relic of historical torture. It's the instrument of the trauma. Josiah didn't speak the devil's words. He was echoing the voice of a mad, dead man, imprinted into this stone and absorbed by a frightened child. Elias secured the scroll. The revelation had not lessened the gravity of the situation. It had magnified it. A demon was a simple enemy. A secret, historical human atrocity, now resurfacing as a psychological contagion, was far more complex and far more dangerous in the hands of a fearful community. "This is the sickness, Clara," Elias said, leading her out of the ruins. A psychological trauma passed through language. And if Josiah was here, then others have been too. We have to move before Blackwood turns this historical truth into a new, more terrible lie. They left the chapel, the wind now seeming to push them urgently back towards the vulnerable town. They had the evidence, but the human cost was rising fast. The mystery of Josiah's words and the strange rosary has just begun. If you want to find out the real human horror behind the possession, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next chapter. Elias and Clara returned home, soaked, chilled, and profoundly disturbed. The small rolled parchment, the confession, lay drying near the fireplace, its words a dark stain on their logical world. Before they could even change their wet clothes, a frantic knocking hammered on their door. It was Deacon Silas Miller, a man whose face was usually carved into a look of stern, unflappable piety. Now his eyes were wide, and the rain-slicked brim of his hat dripped onto the floor. "Dr. Thorne, you must come. It's little Abigail Hayes and Thomas the delivery boy. It has spread. The devil is loosed upon our children." The news was a sickening confirmation of Elias's fear. The psychological contagion, passed through exposure to the chapel's terrible echo, had found its second and third victims. "Tell me what happened, Silas." "Exactly what they did," Elias demanded, grabbing his medical bag. Miller wrung his hands, his usual rigid composure shattered. It was during the evening scripture lesson. Abigail, she stood up, right in the middle of Psalms. She didn't move, just stood, and she started weeping, but not a child's weep. She said she had stained the purity of the Lord's house with the unclean words of the flesh. Then Thomas, sitting next to her, he began to chant, a low, buzzing sound, repeating what the Hayes girl said over and over. It was a prayer of accusation. Elias and Clara exchanged a quick, knowing glance. The rhetoric of the confessor had been memorized and was now being acted out. This wasn't merely imitation. The specific archaic language used suggested a profound, involuntary mental imprinting. "They are not possessed, Silas," Elias stated firmly, already pulling on his boots. "They are afflicted with a severe form of mental distress, a psychological malady." Silas shook his head violently, his eyes filled with terrified certainty. "Nay, doctor, Reverend Blackwood is already with the Hayes family. He says it is the curse of the papist demon you carry in your bag. He saw you take the rosary from Josiah's mother. He says the object carries the devil's power." The gravity of the situation slammed into Elias. The townsfolk were connecting the symptoms not to the location but to the rosary, and by extension to him as the person who handled the cursed object. The Reverend Blackwood, the unchallenged spiritual authority in Harvest Creek, was feeding the hysteria. "Silas, take us to the Hayes house now. But understand this. I'm trying to stop this. Reverend Blackwood is only giving the fear a name, and fear is what truly poisons a community. At the Hayes house, the scene was far worse than at the Gables. Reverend Blackwood, a massive, imposing man whose voice usually boomed with confident authority, was kneeling, sweat beading on his brow despite the damp chill. He was shouting scripture, laying hands on little Abigail, who was now bound to her bed with thick leather straps. Abigail wasn't shouting. She was reciting. Her tiny face was pale, but her eyes were sharp, focusing on Blackwood with chilling intensity. "The rod of iron shall break thee, preacher," she hissed, her voice a reedy imitation of the confessor's chilling pronouncements. "You stand in the pulpit with the stench of the finances of the flesh upon you. Your tithes are bought with usury, your words with vanity." The crowd gathered outside the house, peering through the windows, gasped. The accusation was direct, personal, and aimed at the Reverend's rumored aggressive land-buying habits. Knowledge no child should have, let alone voice with such venomous conviction. Blackwood recoiled as if struck. "Demon, liar, it twists your tongue." Elias pushed through the crowd, Clara right behind him. He knelt by Abigail, ignoring Blackwood's furious glare. He saw the same signs as Josiah, no visible trauma, just an unnaturally high level of anxiety and the inexplicable, highly articulate stream of learned accusation. "Clara, look at her hands," Elias muttered. Abigail's small hands, despite being bound, were stained with a sticky, dark residue. Clara leaned closer. "It's the same residue we found in the chapel near the altar. Lamp oil, Elias. Old, dried lamp oil." Elias turned to Blackwood, his voice cutting through the panic. "Reverend, this child is ill. She is not possessed. The trauma of the words she has heard." "Silence, doctor. You bring the taint of the devil with you," Blackwood roared, rising to his full height. "You possess the unholy relic. I have seen its face. Confess, doctor. Where is the rosary of the demon?" The crowd pressed in, their faces tight with religious fury. They weren't looking at the sick child anymore. They were looking at Elias. "The rosary is a piece of glass and metal, Reverend," Elias countered, standing his ground. "It is the words of a madman, spoken in a remote chapel, that have afflicted these children. I found evidence of a historical abuse, a man known as the Confessor, who forced children to repeat these very phrases. I have his confession." He reached into his coat for the rolled parchment. Blackwood, seeing his spiritual authority threatened by a piece of secular evidence, lunged. "Lies, papist lies. That is an unholy scroll." He struck Elias's hand, sending the parchment flying. The crowd surged, hands reaching out, not to help, but to tear at the evidence. "It's in the chapel, near the altar. The confessor forced them to touch an object, a vessel." Clara cried out, hoping to redirect the attention from the rosary to the true source of the words. A man in the crowd, the local blacksmith, shouted back, his face contorted in fanatic zeal. "He lies. The demon is in the city man. He must be cleansed." Blackwood's eyes, full of a terrifying self-righteous rage, swept over the children, then back to Elias. He saw his power, his standing, and his reputation, all implicitly threatened by the idea that a human cause, not a demonic one, was behind the terrifying events. "The Lord has shown me the way," Blackwood declared, his voice booming over the chaos. "The source of the taint must be removed. Dr. Thorne, you are harboring the object of the curse. Hand it over, or be judged by this community." Elias knew the battle was lost for now. Logic and evidence could not stand against mass hysteria. The town was ready to see him as a conspirator, a carrier of the demonic plague. He had to retreat, secure the evidence, and find the full story of the confessor before more children fell victim. He backed away slowly, pulling Clara with him. "We have to leave, Clara, now." "The scroll," she insisted. "No time. It's too fragile. We have the words in our memory." "We have to find out who the confessor was and why he used lamp oil," Elias whispered, guiding her swiftly out the back door and into the shadows. They mounted Bess, the mare snorting anxiously, and rode out of Harvest Creek. They were no longer the town doctor and his wife. They were fugitives carrying a terrifying, purely human secret. They had to travel to the nearest large settlement, Ozarks, Missouri, to consult historical records, a journey of days to find the full story of the confessor. As they rode away, the image of little Abigail, her face contorted in an echo of ancient abusive rhetoric, was burned into Elias's mind. The human voice, twisted by a disturbed mind, was the only demon at work here, but its power was absolute. The small burgeoning town of Ozarks, a day's grueling ride from the isolated pocket of Harvest Creek, felt like a return to civilization. It possessed a courthouse, a newspaper office, and a small, well-stocked general store. Elias and Clara checked into a modest, clean boarding house under an assumed name. They were exhausted, but the chilling gravity of the situation in Harvest Creek pushed sleep away. Their immediate task was to find the identity of the confessor and the history of the forgotten St. Michael's Chapel. They focused their efforts on the Ozark County Courthouse, a sturdy brick building where old property deeds and records were kept. Elias, using his doctor's credibility as leverage, managed to convince a skeptical elderly clerk to grant them access to the archives. "We're researching the early missionary work in the outlying settlements." Elias lied smoothly, knowing the clerk would never divulge records concerning the forbidden Catholic chapel otherwise. For 2 days, they were immersed in the thick dust of forgotten land deeds and journals. Clara, with her sharp organizational skills, focused on parish and land transfers around the St. Michael's Chapel property. Elias, meanwhile, researched the local newspapers from the 1850s, the Civil War era, a time of intense political and social upheaval that often served as a screen for personal atrocities. Finally, Clara found a faded land deed from 1861. The property surrounding the chapel was transferred from the Catholic diocese to a private landholder after the chapel was forcibly closed due to local discord and the disappearance of the resident priest. The priest's name, scrawled almost illegibly on the deed, Father Alistair Quinn. "Alistair Quinn," Clara repeated, tapping the name. "The confessor." Elias then found a small, single-column article in the Ozarks County Advocate, dated October 1862. The headline was sensational, typical of the era. "Madman Priest Flees, the Red Rosary Heresy." The article detailed the bizarre end of the St. Michael's Chapel. Father Quinn, described as a man of furious zealotry and dangerously rigid doctrine, had become convinced, in the midst of the Civil War chaos and the area's intense religious atmosphere, that the children of the parish were innate vessels of their parents' ancestral sins. "Listen to this, Clara," Elias read aloud, his voice low with horror. Father Quinn instituted a practice he termed the Confession of the Unblemished. He would gather the children in the dark chapel, force them to handle his red rosary, a ceremonial object he used, and make them repeat long, intricate passages of scripture and theology, passages twisted into a formal self-indictment. He believed by making them confess their original corruption with the words of learned men, he was burning the sin from them. Witnesses claimed the children would become catatonic or suffer violent fits after these sessions. Before the townspeople could hold him accountable, Father Quinn vanished. The lamp oil, Clara realized, her eyes wide. The residue we found. The children were sitting in the dark, and he was likely using an oil lamp near the altar. He forced them into sensory deprivation, the darkness, the smell of the oil, the cold stone, and the constant, repetitive, terrifying rhetoric. Elias closed the journal, the sound a sharp punctuation mark in the silent archives. It wasn't a demon's curse. It was a calculated human psychological torture executed by a mad zealot. He created a traumatic verbal ritual that was so intense, so specific, it became a deeply etched memory, a recorded echo in the stone and dust of the chapel. The current children of Harvest Creek, exploring the forbidden ruins, had stumbled upon the physical residue, the oil, the ritual object, the rosary, and the location where the verbal trauma was imprinted. The environment, the atmosphere of fear already present in their minds, triggered the reenactment of the ancient psychological programming. But why are the current children reciting the accusations against the reverend and the town? Clara asked. The scroll mentioned confess the sins of their parents. The original ritual was designed to make them confess their own sin, albeit falsely. Elias considered this, running a hand through his hair. The confessor's full ritual involved more than just self-indictment. The children were forced to confess sins of their ancestry. In their fear and confusion, the current children are simply filling in the blanks. They are latching onto the adult sins they hear whispered about, Blackwood's rumored avarice or other small-town scandals, and projecting them into the ancient script. It's their mind's way of completing the terrifying loop. They had the what and the who. Now they needed the how to stop it. They couldn't simply tell Harvest Creek the truth. Blackwood and his followers, already convinced of a demonic conspiracy, would never believe a story about a mad, dead Catholic priest. They would see it as a greater satanic plot to discredit the Protestant Church. "We have to go back," Elias said, packing the deed and the news clipping into his bag. "But we can't go to the town. We'll ride in under cover of darkness and go straight to Josiah's mother. We must remove the remaining afflicted children from the environment and administer sedatives to break the physical and mental cycle. But we need help. We can't take on the whole town and its reverend." Clara nodded, her face grim. "There is one person who may help, Mrs. Ada Jenkins. She runs the store and has little respect for Reverend Blackwood's fire and brimstone methods. She's a pragmatic soul. More importantly, she has a younger son, Billy, who is Josiah's closest friend. If Billy hasn't been to the chapel, he can help us identify which other children may have been exploring." As they made preparations to leave Ozark, Elias felt a renewed sense of urgency. The demon they were fighting was a dark part of human history, a scar left on the land. And that scar, once disturbed, was spreading like a virulent disease, using the vehicle of religious fear. They had to save the children from the psychological prison created over 30 years ago. Elias and Clara re-entered the Harvest Creek area under the cover of a moonless, heavy night. They bypassed the main settlement, tying Bess in a remote thicket, and proceeded on foot toward the edge of town, where Mrs. Jenkins' general store stood. The town was eerily quiet, not the silence of sleep, but the heavy, fearful stillness of a place waiting for disaster. They moved like shadows, the damp earth muffling their steps. They found Ada Jenkins closing up her store, her face lined with exhaustion and anxiety. Ada was a woman of strong constitution and a grounded mind, qualities rare in the current atmosphere. "Clara, Elias, I didn't think I'd see you again," Ada whispered, pulling them quickly into the warmth of the store. The scent of fresh-cut lumber and tobacco, a small, comforting anchor in the madness. "Blackwood has been turning the town against you. He's telling everyone you're an agent of the devil, tasked to remove the cursed Rosary to silence the children's holy message. The children's message is a lie, Ada. A terrifying echo," Elias said, quickly and concisely outlining their findings. The story of Father Quinn, the confessor, the psychological ritual, and the ancient trauma imprinted on the chapel walls. He showed her the newspaper clipping, the evidence of historical human cruelty. Ada read the article twice, her lips moving silently. When she looked up, her expression had shifted from fear to a cold, steady resolve. A mad priest, not a demon, a psychological sickness. God help them all. "We need your help, Ada," Clara said. "We can't approach the houses directly. We need to know who else was with Josiah and Abigail at that chapel. Billy is Josiah's friend. Did he go to the ruin?" Ada shook her head, relief momentarily easing the tension in her face. "No. Billy was with me, helping me restock the winter stores. He hates that old chapel, says it smells like old guilt. But he told me 3 names, 3 boys who bragged to him about going on a forbidden quest to the old stones. Young Peter, the miller's son, little Henry from the tanner's family, and a boy named Samuel from the edge of the woods." Elias gripped the counter. 5 children so far: Josiah, Abigail, Thomas, Peter, and Henry. Samuel is a possibility. The contagion is spreading rapidly. We need to secure them all and get them out of town for treatment before Blackwood pushes the community to some act of permanent, irreversible madness. Clara added, "The key to stopping the cycle is to break the sensory connection. We need to get them away from the memory of the chapel and administer a calming agent to interrupt the loop of anxiety and recitation. But Blackwood and his deacons are watching the afflicted homes like hawks, guarding against outsiders." Ada considered this, her eyes darting between the closed front door and the narrow alley window. "I can help with Peter. His father, the miller, is a stubborn man, but Peter has always been sickly. I can send a message through his aunt that he has a high fever that needs treatment at the earliest hour, convincing his aunt to bring him here, to the store. It's neutral ground, and his father is away at the mill tonight." That leaves Henry and Samuel, Elias said, his mind racing. The tanner's house is close to the river. Samuel lives too far out. We need to move fast. If even one more child manifests the symptoms, the town will erupt. A sudden sound of muffled weeping drifted from the street outside. A low, persistent, unsettling sound. Elias quickly moved to the window, pulling the edge of the curtain back slightly. Down the main road, a small procession was moving toward the Reverend Blackwood's house. At the center was a woman weeping uncontrollably, being supported by her husband. Between them, walking with a strange, stiff-legged march, was a small boy. Little Henry, the tanner's son. His face was drawn, and he wasn't crying, yet his mouth was moving constantly, mouthing silent, rapid words. As they passed a sputtering street lamp, Elias caught a glimpse of his hands. They were scraping at the fabric of his trousers, a small, involuntary and rapid gesture. "The lamp oil," Clara breathed, recognizing the compulsive action. He's trying to scrape the residue off his hands. The trauma is now physically manifesting. He's already in the loop. They're taking him to Blackwood, Elias realized, his stomach clenching. The Reverend will seize on this. He'll use the boy's distress as confirmation of the demonic spread, tightening his grip on the town's fear. The situation had just escalated from a medical emergency to a race against a dangerous, self-fulfilling prophecy. They had to intercept Henry before Blackwood could use him as a pulpit demonstration. "Ada, focus on Peter," Elias commanded. "Tell the aunt we will meet them at the river crossing before dawn. Clara and I are going to the Tanner house. We need to understand when Henry went to the chapel, and more importantly, if he took anything else from that ruin." Leaving the relative safety of the store, Elias and Clara melted back into the shadows. They circled around the main road, heading toward the small wooden house of the Tanner family. The air was colder now, the silence broken only by the chirping of crickets and the frantic, echoing thoughts in Elias's mind. They reached the Tanner house to find it deserted, save for the sickly yellow light spilling from a back window, illuminating the small, untended garden. Henry's parents had rushed him straight to the Reverend's home. Elias cautiously entered the house through the unlocked back door. The small cottage was tidy, reflecting the hard-working nature of the family. He and Clara searched quickly but methodically, looking for anything a boy might have brought back from a forbidden trip. In Henry's small bedroom, tucked under his mattress, Elias found a brittle, stained book. It was not a Bible. It was a cheap, leather-bound volume, missing its cover. Inside, the pages were filled with densely packed handwritten text in the same ornate copperplate script as the confessor's scroll. "My God, it's the confessor's journal," Elias breathed, flipping through the pages. The text was a manic, detailed account of Father Quinn's increasingly twisted spiritual beliefs, detailing his techniques of psychological abuse. In the margins, alongside a terrifying diagram of the human soul being purified by fire, was a drawing of the Rosary and an instruction written underneath. To make the word of the Lord clear, the vessel must be made to speak the words into the stone, so that the very walls may remember the price of sin. Clara pointed to a fresh, dark smear on the page beside the drawing. He didn't just hear the words, Elias. Henry must have been trying to recreate the ritual. The children, in their innocence, were not just affected by the trauma. They were actively trying to reenact it, turning themselves into vessels for the recorded echo. The full journal gave them the complete ritual, the terrifying vocabulary of accusation, and the motivation behind the confessor's madness. The journal was the ultimate piece of evidence, but also the ultimate danger. As Elias tucked the journal into his medical satchel, a chilling sound echoed from the front yard, a heavy, rhythmic chanting. The sound was growing louder, moving quickly down the street. "They're coming back," Clara hissed, pulling Elias toward the back door. Blackwood must have sent a vigilante group to search the home for demonic artifacts. "We've been exposed." They slipped out the back door just as the front door burst inward with a deafening crash. The chanting grew louder, a chorus of angry, fearful voices. "Confess! Confess! Burn the taint!" Elias and Clara ran into the darkness, the full, crushing weight of human madness pursuing them. They were alone against the deep-seated fears of an entire, isolated community, and they held the key to its terrifying human secret. Elias and Clara spent the rest of the night hiding in the dense thicket by the river crossing, the confessor's journal clutched tightly in Elias's bag. The sounds of search parties, their lanterns bobbing like angry, erratic fireflies, echoed through the woods. The town had tipped into full-blown religious paranoia. At the first grey-blue light of dawn, they saw a woman approach the river crossing, leading a boy by the hand. It was Mrs. Miller, Peter the miller's son's aunt, her face pale with worry. Young Peter walked normally, but his eyes were darting around, and he constantly touched his mouth as if trying to taste the air. He hadn't fully manifested the confessor's echo, but his agitation was clear. "Ada sent me," Mrs. Miller whispered, glancing fearfully over her shoulder. "She said he needs city doctor's medicine for a sickness he won't admit to. His father is still at the mill." Elias wasted no time. He administered a strong but safe sedative, mixed with water and a pinch of sugar. Within minutes, Peter was deeply asleep. "We need to get him out of the Ozarks, Aunt," Elias instructed, wrapping the boy in a blanket. "Take him to Ozark Town, to the boarding house near the courthouse. Wait for us there. Do not talk to anyone about why you are leaving. Tell them he needs city air." Once Peter and his aunt were safely on the road to Ozark, Elias turned to Clara. "We have the pattern, the chapel, the fear, the contamination, the zealotry. But the full scope of Blackwood's madness is still unknown. Why is he resisting the truth so fiercely?" "Because the children's confessions attack him personally, Elias," Clara replied, her voice taut with urgency. "Abigail accused him of usury and vanity. The full confessor's ritual, as described in the scroll, forced the children to confess the sins of their ancestry. Blackwood's family is one of the oldest in the creek. What if his own family history is tied to the confessor, or worse, to the disappearance of Father Quinn?" The thought was a cold jolt, a purely human horror story, a cover-up, not a curse. "We have to get the other children. We need to go to Widow Gables and the Hayes house," Elias decided. "That's suicide, Elias. They are being guarded by armed men," Clara countered. "We need a diversion, and we need to go where Blackwood's authority is weak. The only place he can't fully control is the very focus of the fear, the old chapel." Elias looked at her, understanding dawning. The confessor's final act of defiance. "We recreate the crime scene." They made their way back to the main road, moving cautiously. The town was beginning to stir, but the atmosphere was feverish. As they neared the main square, they saw the scene that confirmed their darkest fears. Outside Reverend Blackwood's imposing house, a large crowd had gathered. In the center, in a pen made of hastily assembled fence posts, were Josiah, Abigail, and Thomas. They were sitting, slumped, but still rocking gently, muttering their phrases of accusation and self-indictment. Blackwood stood on the porch, a figure of righteous rage, his Bible raised high. "The Lord has revealed the demon's plan," he shouted, his voice hoarse from hours of preaching. "The city doctor Thorne is in league with the ancient evil. He stole the one true relic, the Holy Rosary, to hide its power. But the children's spirits are strong. They speak the truth of the taint he wishes to conceal." He pointed to Josiah. "Tell them, son, tell them the doctor's wickedness." Josiah's eyes fluttered, and the familiar, chillingly adult voice scraped out, "The physician seeks to bind the truth with the chains of the world. He denies the spirit, and by his denial, he feeds the corruption." The crowd roared with terrified agreement. This was Blackwood's cleansing ritual. He wasn't trying to cure the children. He was using their afflicted state to solidify his power and eliminate any voice of dissent. any logical explanation that challenged his authority. Elias saw his opening. "We can't get to the children, Clara, but we can expose Blackwood's hypocrisy." They slipped away and made the grueling journey back to the chapel. Once inside, in the cold, dusty ruin, Elias pulled out a small stoppered jar of the dark, sticky residue he had scraped from the chapel floor and the Tanner house, the old lamp oil. He quickly fashioned a crude torch from a stick and a piece of old cloth, soaking it in the oil. Clara, meanwhile, used the journal to identify a specific, chilling passage that the confessor had forced his victims to memorize, a passage dealing with the burden of wealth and the false idol of the ledger. This was a direct parallel to the accusations the children were making against Blackwood's avarice. As darkness fell, Elias and Clara positioned themselves on a slight ridge overlooking Harvest Creek. Below them, they could see the bonfire burning outside Blackwood's house. The final act of the cleansing ritual was about to begin. The flames were licking high into the night sky, casting dancing, erratic shadows on the assembled townspeople. "They're going to use the fire to try and burn the taint out of them," Elias whispered, horrified. Clara nodded grimly. "We have to draw them away." Elias lit the crude torch, the decades-old lamp oil flaring up with a thick, sooty column of smoke. He then began to shout, his voice echoing off the hills, an unnerving, high-pitched imitation of a child's terror, combined with the chilling, learned rhetoric of the confessor. "The fire of the Lord is come. It is come for the sins of the fathers. I see the ledger of greed. The names of the taint are written in the stone." He waved the oil-soaked torch erratically, mimicking the movements of a small, frightened person in the darkness. The torch, soaked in the oil, created a small, terrifying spectacle. Down in the square, the chanting stopped abruptly. The crowd turned, their terrified gazes drawn to the erratic light, and the chilling, accusatory voice echoing from the forbidden hill. "The demon calls from the unclean place," someone shouted. Blackwood, unwilling to surrender his control but terrified of a demon that was actively contradicting his message, hesitated. The fear of the forbidden chapel, the root of all the town's anxiety, proved stronger than his immediate authority. "The source of the taint to the chapel. We must destroy the source," Blackwood bellowed, seizing the momentum of their terror. The crowd surged away from the bonfire and the children, stampeding up the hill toward the unsettling light and the ancient, twisted voice. Elias and Clara had their diversion. They immediately raced down the hill towards the deserted town square. The town square was empty, save for the crackling bonfire and the three afflicted children, Josiah, Abigail, and Thomas, huddled in their makeshift wooden pen. The chanting of the mob receded into the distance, a low, savage drone as they approached the forbidden hill and the decoy light. Elias and Clara reached the pen. The children looked up, their eyes vacant and yet acutely aware. "We have to break the psychological loop now before the mob returns," Elias said, fumbling in his bag for his syringe and a vial of sedative. He reached for Josiah, but the boy recoiled, his face contorting. "Do not touch the vessel of the Lord. You are the denier of the holy word." "He's still in the ritual state," Clara noted urgently. "We have to break the script." Elias injected the sedative into Josiah's arm quickly and then moved to Abigail and Thomas, administering the calming agent. As the medicine took effect, the rigid tension began to drain from their small bodies, and their rapid, muttering recitations slowed. "We need to get them on the horses," Elias said, scooping Josiah into his arms. Just as they reached the edge of the square, the sounds of the mob returned, closer and louder. Their screams were not just of fear, but of frustrated, murderous rage. The decoy had worked, but it had made them angrier. "They found the torch, Elias. They know they were tricked," Clara cried, hoisting Thomas onto her back. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows of the mill road, moving with a massive, enraged speed. It was Reverend Blackwood, his clothes torn, his face smeared with dirt and sweat, his eyes blazing with psychotic fury. He had broken away from the mob. "Thorn, you have revealed your true face," Blackwood roared, holding a heavy wooden piece of fence rail like a club. "You steal the children's truth to save your own. Wicked denial." Elias set Josiah down gently, standing between the Reverend and the children. "It's over, Blackwood. The demon is dead." It was a man named Father Alistair Quinn, a mad zealot from the Civil War era. The children are victims of psychological abuse, a sickness, not a curse. He pulled out the confessor's journal, waving it at the Reverend. "I have his words, his madness. He forced children to confess the sins of their fathers. Why do you fight the truth, Reverend? What did your father do to Father Quinn?" Blackwood stopped dead in his tracks, his furious momentum arrested by the question. His face already contorted, drained of blood. "Lies, damnable lies," he shrieked, but there was a tremor of genuine terror in his voice. Clara stepped forward, her voice ringing with clear, cold accusation. In the confessor's journal, he writes of his greatest fear. A group of Protestant zealots who discovered his ritual and threatened to expose him. They used his own red rosary as a symbol to shame him. Your father, Reverend, was one of them, wasn't he? He was the one who drove the mad priest to his final act of self-flagellation. Elias pressed the attack. "The full truth, Reverend. The community believes Father Quinn fled. The old deed from 1861 says the chapel was closed due to a disappearance." Blackwood's veneer of righteousness finally cracked, exposing the horrifying, purely human rot beneath. His eyes flickered to the ground at his feet. "He polluted the youth," Blackwood choked out, his voice a ragged whisper. "He was a papist pervert. My father and the others, they only sought to cleanse the house of the Lord. They forced him to leave. They buried the rosary near the altar to show him the shame of his faith." The confessor hadn't simply fled. He had been driven out, terrorized, and his central relic used against him. "You're still lying, Reverend," Elias said, his voice hard. "You aren't protecting your faith. You're protecting your inheritance." The confessor's journal mentions a hidden ledger detailing the corrupt financial dealings of the early settlers. Dealings that enriched your father and which you have continued. The children's accusations about usury were aimed at you because you have repeated your father's sins. Blackwood let out a primal scream, a sound of profound spiritual and personal defeat. He raised the wooden club and rushed at Elias, driven by a need to silence the truth forever. Elias dodged the wild swing. Blackwood, massive and enraged, stumbled, tripping over the heavy rope that once secured the children's pen. He fell, his head striking the edge of the pen with a sickening thud. The wooden club flew from his hand and landed silently in the dirt. The Reverend lay still, unconscious, his mask of holy zealotry finally, permanently shattered. The sound of the mob was now dangerously close, pouring out of the woods and into the square. "No time, Elias. They'll tear us apart if they see the Reverend like this," Clara urged, helping the last groggy child onto Bess, who was tied nearby. "Go, take the children," Elias commanded. "Ride hard for Ozarks. I have to secure the journal and the unconscious Reverend. The law needs to know the full truth." Clara hesitated for only a second, her love for Elias battling with her duty to the children. She slapped Bess's flank, and the horse, loaded with 3 sleeping children and Clara, galloped away into the final darkness before dawn. Elias stood alone in the square, the bonfire raging beside him, the unconscious Reverend Blackwood lying at his feet, and the enraged mob surging toward him. He pulled the confessor's journal from his bag, holding the fragile, terrifying document aloft, waiting for the crowd to arrive. The truth was his only weapon, and he was about to use it. The true terror was not a demon, but the centuries-long ability of men to twist faith into an instrument of fear and personal gain. The air was thick with the scent of pine smoke and the visceral, guttural sounds of the approaching mob. Elias stood his ground near the blazing bonfire, the unconscious form of Reverend Blackwood, a stark, defeated monument at his feet. The crowd poured into the square, a surging wave of farmers, mill hands, and shopkeepers, their faces contorted by a terrifying mix of exhaustion, fear, and righteous vengeance. Their eyes, wide and wild in the erratic light of the fire, immediately locked onto Elias and the prostrate Reverend. A large, enraged man, the blacksmith, whose own son, Thomas, had been among the afflicted, surged to the front. "Thorn, where are the children? Where is the rosary of the demon?" Elias held the confessor's journal high, the brittle pages shimmering in the heat. "The children are safe, away from the sickness you and your reverend have imposed upon them." Elias's voice was strained, but he forced it to be loud, cutting through the chaos. "They were not possessed by any demon. They were afflicted by the words of a madman, a trauma that your beloved Reverend Blackwood has been using to manipulate you." The mob faltered, momentarily stunned by the direct confrontation. They looked from the defeated Blackwood to Elias, the outsider, the man of science. "He lies. Blackwood speaks the truth of the Lord," screamed a woman from the back, her fear reasserting itself. "The truth?" Elias roared, taking a step toward the fire, using the intensity of the flame to underscore his words. "The truth is a cover-up. The truth is that 30 years ago, a zealot named Father Alistair Quinn twisted the faith into a tool of mental abuse, forcing children to repeat a liturgy of self-condemnation. And when your ancestors, including the Reverend's father, found out, they didn't go to the law. They drove the priest to his death to conceal his madness because he threatened to expose their own financial corruption." He thrust the confessor's journal forward. "This is the proof. The personal record of the man you call a demon." He wrote that his greatest fear was the Protestant zealots who threatened to expose his heresy and expose their greed. The blacksmith, holding a broken shovel, stepped toward Elias. "You speak of greed. Where is your proof? This is the work of the devil trying to divide us." "Your proof is right here," Elias yelled, flipping open a page of the journal. "Listen to the words the confessor forced your children to memorize. The words they are now repeating. They speak of usury and the false idol of the ledger. They are repeating the very words Quinn used to threaten your ancestors, words that refer to the land swindles and the loan-sharking Blackwood's family used to acquire their wealth." He pointed the journal at Blackwood's inert body. "The Reverend resisted my investigation because the children's demonic voices were actually the voices of history, accusing him of repeating his father's sins. He was using your terror to silence the truth and protect his inheritance." The words hung heavy in the smoke-filled air. The mob was no longer a single cohesive entity. It fractured into murmurs and fearful glances. They were an isolated community, and Blackwood's power was built on the unquestioning acceptance of his family's historical piety. To believe Elias was to admit that their entire moral foundation was a lie, constructed to mask a generations-old crime. "The rosary," a man yelled. "It was the rosary that afflicted them. You stole it." "The rosary is a piece of metal and glass," Elias countered, pulling the red beads from his pocket, their color looking dull and harmless in his steady hand. It was the prop of a ritual. The children's hands were covered in lamp oil from the chapel floor. The oil, the darkness, and the repetitive words created a severe anxiety-induced psychosis that made them relive the confessor's ritual. The fever is real, the distress is real, but the demon is a memory. Elias knew he had to solidify the truth with one final, undeniable piece of evidence. He knelt and rolled the unconscious Blackwood onto his side. The Reverend's coat was ripped. He reached into the lining of the coat and pulled out a tightly rolled dark leather belt. It was not a normal belt. It was a crude, makeshift flagellation whip, dried bloodstains visible on the frayed leather thongs. Reverend Blackwood preached God's love to you all, yet he practiced self-flagellation in his private hours. He was not fighting a demon, he was fighting the inherited guilt of his father's sins. He was as tormented as the children, and he projected his own guilt onto the weakest among you. The only demon here is the guilt and fear passed down from one man to another. The sight of the whip, the physical manifestation of Blackwood's secret torment, was the final breaking point. The mob went silent, their fury replaced by a profound, chilling realization. Their pastor, their spiritual shepherd, was a hypocrite, a tormented fraud, whose zealotry was built on generational lies. The demon was simply human cruelty and guilt. The blacksmith lowered his shovel, his eyes fixed on the whip. My son is just sick." "Your son is traumatized," Elias confirmed, standing up. "He needs medicine and a safe distance from this place." He looked around the circle of defeated faces. "The children are on their way to Ozarks, where they will receive real medical care. This man," Elias pointed to Blackwood, "will be handed over to the county sheriff for both the physical abuse of the children and the historical cover-up of Father Quinn's death, which I believe was not an accident, but a murder." The mob, drained of their fear and their conviction, slowly began to disperse. They did not help Blackwood, nor did they try to stop Elias. They simply walked away from the bonfire, each man and woman left alone with the unsettling, ugly truth of their community's foundation. Elias had won the physical battle, but the war against ignorance and fear was far from over. He needed to ensure the full truth was recorded and the children were healed. He quickly gathered the journal and the rosary and secured Blackwood with a length of rope, waiting for the full light of dawn to make the ride to Ozarks and the proper authorities. Elias arrived in Ozarks near midday, leading Bess, who was carrying the bound, still unconscious Reverend Blackwood. The sight of the defeated pastor, covered in dirt and cuts, created a sensation in the small county seat. Elias immediately went to the county sheriff's office, a small, somber man named Sheriff Dale. Laying the confessor's journal and the newspaper clipping on Dale's desk, Elias began to speak, his voice tired but precise, detailing the events in Harvest Creek, the psychological contagion, the confessor's ritual, and Blackwood's deliberate exploitation of the community's fear to maintain his power. Sheriff Dale, a man who had seen the worst of human nature in the isolated Ozarks, listened in stunned silence. "A cult of psychological abuse, Dr. Thorne," the sheriff murmured, turning over the red rosary in his hand. "And a cover-up that lasted 30 years. You've brought down the most powerful man in that part of the county." Elias nodded. "The children are the victims. They are safe now, under the care of my wife Clara and a friend, Mrs. Jenkins, at the boarding house. They are receiving sedatives and are slowly recovering from the trauma. But the entire community is psychologically wounded. They need truth, not sermons." Sheriff Dale had Blackwood secured in the county jail. While the Reverend's fate rested on the legal system, Elias's priority remained the children and the community. Clara and Ada Jenkins had managed to secure all 5 children: Josiah, Abigail, Thomas, Henry, and Samuel, who had been found in a state of high anxiety at his home, the contagion reaching him late. Their faces were now restful, free from the terrifying contortions of the confessor's echo. Elias spent the afternoon with them, observing their slow return to normal childhood behavior. The treatment was simple: constant reassurance, removal from the source of the trauma, and time. He explained their illness not as a curse, but as a severe fright, a bad dream brought on by an old, dark place. He was giving them a new narrative, one rooted in science and healing, not fear. "We have to return, Elias," Clara said that evening, standing by the window of the boarding house. "Not to fight, but to heal. The town needs to see the children fully recovered, and they need to hear the truth from someone they trust, Ada and me." Elias agreed. He used the courthouse's printing press to create a small, simple leaflet containing 3 things. 1. The full, unedited text of the confessor's scroll. 2. The newspaper clipping from 1862 detailing Father Quinn's madness. And 3. A statement, signed by Elias, Clara, and Ada, explaining the affliction as a psychological trauma caused by the historical events and the chapel's lingering influence. We are giving them the facts, the evidence, and the logical explanation, Elias said, handing a stack of the leaflets to Ada. But the ultimate burden of belief falls on them. You and Clara are their neighbors. You are the only ones who can start to rebuild their trust in human reason. The next morning, Elias stayed behind in Ozarks to testify to the sheriff and arrange for medical supplies. Clara and Ada, armed only with the leaflets and the quiet confidence of the truth, rode back to the stunned silence of Harvest Creek. Their return was not triumphant, but quiet and firm. They went to the church and pinned the leaflets to the heavy oak doors. They went to the mill and the general store, handing the documents to the townspeople who approached them, not with anger, but with hesitant curiosity. The truth was an ugly, heavy thing, but it was far less terrifying than the certainty of a demon. The words of the confessor's journal, read in the cold light of day, became an account of madness and abuse, not a divine message. The children's affliction, now understood as the echo of a forgotten human crime, was no longer a curse, but a wound that could be healed. The full psychological reckoning of Harvest Creek had begun. The town's fear of the demon of the Rosary was slowly replaced by the difficult but ultimately healthier realization of the human capacity for cruelty and deception. They had to face the ugly truth about their ancestors and their trusted reverend. It was a trauma in itself, but one that paved the way for authentic healing and growth, free from the destructive fear that had almost consumed them. 6 weeks later, the Ozark Hills had surrendered to the crisp clarity of autumn. The foliage was a riot of deep golds and burning reds, a deceptive beauty that concealed the scars of the recent past. The town of Harvest Creek was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet now, the sound of recovery. The initial shock of Reverend Blackwood's arrest and the undeniable documented truth of the confessor's madness had subsided into a painful communal self-reflection. The children, now safely back in their homes, were healing. Josiah, Abigail, and the others no longer suffered the fever or the terrifying fits of recitation. Elias, who traveled back to Harvest Creek every week, had diagnosed the affliction as a severe case of anxiety hysteria brought on by the specific trauma. The combination of sedatives, a change of scenery, and the simple removal of the fear-inducing object had worked. The true healing, Elias knew, was not medical, but psychological and communal. The community had to actively reject the narrative of the demon and embrace the narrative of the truth. One crisp Saturday morning, Elias and Clara rode out to the St. Michael's Chapel. The town had spent the last 2 weeks talking about the ruin, and the consensus had been reached. The place of the historical horror had to be dealt with, not by prayer, but by human action. They found a small gathering of men there, led by the blacksmith and Peter's father, the miller. They were not carrying torches or weapons, but simple tools, shovels, picks, and crowbars. "Dr. Thorne," the miller said, his voice measured, "we read the leaflets. We understand now. The demon was never in the stone. It was in the words and the fear of men." The blacksmith stepped forward, a heavy sledgehammer in his hands. "We have decided this place will no longer hold the echo of that madness. We will take it down, stone by stone, and use the wood for the new schoolhouse foundation." Elias watched as the men set to work, dismantling the physical shell of the historical trauma. They worked not with religious frenzy, but with quiet, deliberate labor, turning a monument to fear into the raw material for a foundation of education and progress. Elias walked to the decaying altar. The confessor's journal and the red rosary had been given to the sheriff as evidence, but he knew one small piece of the past remained. He pulled out the dark glass shard he had found, the piece of the old oil lamp. He held it up to the sun, a piece of mundane refuse that had played a crucial role in a terrifying human drama. He saw Josiah and the other boys standing nearby watching the men work. They looked healthy, but Elias knew the scar of the fear would always remain. He approached Josiah. "Do you remember the words, Josiah?" The boy looked at him, his expression clear and calm. "I remember a noise, Doctor, like a bad dream." "That is good, son," Elias said softly. "It was just a noise, just a bad dream." Elias knelt by the boy, and with a small, quiet movement, he pressed the dark glass shard into the soft earth at the base of a freshly dug pit. It was a silent, secular burial of the last remaining relic of the trauma. Clara joined him, resting a hand on his shoulder. "It's over, Elias. The healing has begun." "Only begun," he corrected, watching the townspeople labor. The demon of the Rosary was simply the human ability to believe in the worst of ourselves. It wasn't a curse, it was a choice. A choice to believe in fear over truth, in dogma over compassion. That is a demon that lives in every heart, and the fight against it is endless. The story of Harvest Creek would become a grim legend in the Ozarks, told not as a tale of ghosts or devils, but as a chilling account of human fanaticism and the dark echoes of history. It was a story that confirmed the terrifying reality. The greatest horrors are always born not in the supernatural void, but in the deepest, most tormented corners of the human heart.